This video will teach you how to play with, and against the Blackmar-Diemer Gambit, characterized by the moves d4, d5, e4, d takes c4, knight c3, knight f6. Now, how do you think white should play? In other words, what is the defining move of the Blackmar-Diemer Gambit? The answer, 4. e3, and the main line follows, taking the pawn with knight takes f3. Recapturing with the queen is also playable and is known as the Rider Gambit, in which we touched upon in the video titled Hollows or Trap, Blackmar-Diemer Gambit. If you have not watched that video, I advise you to do so now. In this position, how do you think black should defend? Pause the video and take some time to find a move. Black has 5 major options at his disposal. Hopefully you chose one of them. If not, it's okay, because by the end of this video you will be well familiarized with this position. And I promise, no more questions, so sit back, enjoy the video, and remember, if the video is moving too fast, do not hesitate to hit pause. Now back to the video. The 5 options are bishop f5, Gunderam Defense, bishop g4, Teichmann Defense, e6, Euwe Defense, g6, Bogoljubov Defense, c6, Ziegler Defense, the Gunderam Defense, bishop f5. The line was extensively analyzed by Gunderam, who published his analysis in a book, Blackmar-Diemer Gambit, in 1984. The main response for white is knight e5, intending to attack the black bishop with an advance of the kingside pawns and, if appropriate, weaken black's kingside pawn structure with knight e5 times bishop g6. Black can respond with e6, when after g4, bishop e4, leads to tremendous complications. More common is bishop g6, which leads to quieter play, when white's best response is probably bishop g2, c6, h4, with a sustained kingside initiative in return for the pawn. However, black also has the option c6, intending g4, bishop e6, when white has to play accurately to prove enough compensation for the pawn. White has an alternative in bishop d3, directly challenging the bishop, but Christoph Scherer doubts that white gets enough compensation after bishop takes d3, queen takes d3, c6, intending e6, knight b, d7, bishop e7, and castle kingside. With a solid position, the Teichmann Defense, bishop g4. This move pins the knight, often with the intention of swapping it off and undermining white's central control. White's best response is to attack the bishop immediately with h3, when play often continues bishop takes f3, queen takes f3, c6, but not knight c6, when bishop b5 is good for white. In this position, white can defend the attacked d-pawn with queen f2, the Chiselski variation, but this allows black an easy game by preparing e5, for example after 8, knight b, d7, bishop d3, e5. Alternatively, bishop e3 is the classical variation, where white aims for a slow build-up to a kingside offensive. White's other main alternative is g4, the Seidel Hall attack, where white is happy to sacrifice the d-pawn in order to gain an increased initiative on the kingside, for example after queen takes d4, bishop e3, queen e5, castle queenside, e6, g5. Black can decline the pawn, for example after e6, g5, knight d5, bishop d3, leading to sharp play. Alternatively, after h3, black can retreat the bishop with bishop h5, g4, bishop g6, knight e5. Euwe Defense e6. This line, analyzed by Max Euwe, aims to reach a French defense-type position, but with black having an extra pawn. Play usually continues bishop g5, bishop e7, when white's most popular option is bishop d3. Black can attack the center immediately with c5. Here, as recommended by Joe Gallagher and James Resitano, play can continue d takes c5, queen a5, castle kingside. Queen takes c5, king h1, when white has to play accurately to prove compensation for the pawn. Alternatively, knight c6 can be considered the main line of this variation, when 8, castle kingside. Knight takes d4, king h1, is the notorious Zilberman's Gambit, sacrificing a second pawn in order to increase white's initiative. The Zilberman's Gambit is scored well in practice, but objectively it probably does not give white enough compensation for 2 pawns. However, the alternative a3, despite the loss of time, offers white good compensation for the pawn, and white can also consider queen d2, allowing the trade of the bishop on d3, but avoiding any loss of time. White's main alternative to bishop d3 is queen d2, aiming to castle queenside and giving additional support to the d4 pawn, while aiming to launch a kingside offensive with queen d2 to f4, and meeting h6 with a dangerous bishop takes h6 sacrifice. The Bogoljubov Defense g6. The Bogoljubov Defense was played by Diemer himself in a game against Bogoljubov. By fianchettoing the king's bishop, black aims to gain increased pressure against the d4 pawn following a subsequent c5. White's most common response is the studier attack, bishop c4, bishop g7, castle kingside. Castle kingside. Queen e1, intending queen h4, bishop h6, and piling pressure on the kingside, sacrificing pawns at d4 and c2, if appropriate, and black has to play accurately in order to survive. However, after repeatedly binds knight c6, queen h4, bishop g4. It is doubtful if white obtains enough compensation for the pawn against accurate play. An alternative approach is to castle queenside, play bishop h6, and then launch the h-pawn against the black kingside. The best way to carry out this approach is via bishop f4, as bishop g5, as played by Bogoljubov in his game against Diemer, is well met by bishop g7, queen d2, castle kingside. Castle queenside. c5. When black stands better. Note, if black tries the same approach against bishop f4, that is bishop g7, queen d2, castle kingside. Castle queenside. c5, then white gets good chances with d5, a6, d6. Ziegler Defense c6. Black's most critical response to the Blackmar-Diemer Gambit is c6, known as the Ziegler Defense, but most of the theory of the line was established by Gunderam, who advocated bishop f5. Most modern authors recommend this as black's antidote to the Blackmar-Diemer Gambit. The old main line runs bishop c4, bishop f5, castle kingside. e6, knight e5, when black should avoid bishop takes c2. Knight takes f7. But instead play bishop g6. When white ends up with very little to show for the lost pawn. More dangerous for black is knight g5, the alchemy variation, where black has to be careful not to fall for various sacrifices on e6 and f7, but white probably does not get enough compensation for the pawn after bishop g6, knight e2, bishop d6. However, Lev Gutman proposed the alternative bishop g5, e6, knight h4. Bishop g6, knight takes g6, h takes g6, queen d3, intending to castle queenside and tie black down to the f7 pawn, promising long-term positional compensation for the pawn. There are currently insufficient practical tests to determine whether it amounts to enough compensation for the lost pawn. Black cannot easily deviate from this line, since after 7, knight b, d7 white continues queen e2, e6, castle queenside, aiming to launch a strong attack down the e and f files, and if bishop b4, then d5. If white tries to enter this setup after e6, queen e2, however, then bishop b4 prevents white from safely castling queenside, leaving white with insufficient compensation for the pawn. White also has the dangerous, though probably objectively insufficient, second pawn sacrifice g4, analyzed extensively by Stefan Bucher. In the c6 move order, white has the alternative bishop d3, usually intending to sacrifice a second pawn after bishop g4, h3, bishop takes f3, queen takes f3, queen takes d4, leading to sharp complications, though black can transpose back to the classical variation of the Teichmann defense with e6, since white's only good response is bishop e3. Thanks for tuning into BK Academy of Chess, and I hope you enjoyed the video.